Kia ora everyone, thank you for coming. Today I thought I would talk about representing the diversity of Pacific Peoples Ethnicities and make it quite specific to rehabilitation research. Like Debbie said, I'm going to start talking a bit about me. Then I wanted to talk about ethnicity as a variable in research. It's a bit geeky, I think, talking about it like that, but hopefully maybe you'll learn something new or clarify something in your mind. Then I'm going to give an overview of Pacific people in Aotearoa, New Zealand, talk a little bit about a study that I'm doing looking at the cardiac rehabilitation outcomes at Auckland DHB, and then some final thoughts if I have time chucked in there. So when I think about me, I think about the islands that I come from. One of these islands are not like the others. So on my dad's side, my family is from Ballymena in Northern Ireland. That's where I was born. My parents met in London and then had me in Ireland. And then when I was 3 months old, my Samoan grandfather, who was living in New Zealand, said, "You have to bring my girls home." And so my dad said, "Sure, why not? Move across the other side of the world." And then we moved to New Zealand, and that's where home has been ever since. And so my grandfather is from Papasatawa in Savaii. This is kind of where the coastline is from where we're from. And then my grandmother is from Moke in the Cook Islands. And then our Moke house is just over here. My grandparents, who you can see over here, immigrated to New Zealand in the 1950s, looking for better opportunities, and like many Pacific people were doing at the time. And they were very strategic and intentional about when they moved here. And so what they did was they set up communities with their extended family. So that's my granddad's cousins. And these communities were often wrapped around the church as well. And they had decided that together, which I think is really impressive for a bunch of young adults in a new country to come together and decide that they were going to strategically invest in their family's education. So they set up initiatives where they would have family gatherings. And so part of that was to keep everyone connected as a village, but also a part of these family gatherings was to incentivize my mum and her cousins to become educated. And they would have a pot of money that everyone would put in together. And then whoever passed their school C or whatever it was at the time, you got a crack at that pot of money. And so they were very intentional about education was the way forward, which I think is super impressive. And credit to them, most of my mum and some of my aunties and uncles, they are tertiary qualified. My mum is a bachelor's, and then me and my cousins, some of us have postgraduate qualifications. So I think that their strategy paid off, and that, we really thank them for their initiative and foresight in that. Part of coming to New Zealand, though, was also about, learning how to be successful in New Zealand. And so to do that, for the education, they didn't teach my mum or my aunties and uncles how to speak any of their languages. That's what they saw at the time was being going to be useful to them, to be able to speak English and speak English really well, to be able to dress really well, and to have limited, judgments and stereotypes put on them. Regardless, we did grow up still being very proud of our roots. Here I'm in Samoan cultural outfit, and here I'm doing very bad hula for some family that had come from the islands, and we were having some family celebration. There's my brother on the ground and my cousin. And I grew up very connected with my grandparents. So for long periods, long blocks of my life, we lived at their house with them. So with my parents, we all lived together. And then if we weren't living with them, I was dropped off there morning, before school, after school, and in the school holidays. So they had a big influence in my life. And there were things that like I included this picture because this is the altar at their house, and there were things that I guess I always just thought was normal, that everyone has an altar that looks like that at their house. I've been to aunties and uncles' houses, they had altars like that. And then I started going to some of my Pakeha friends' houses, and I was like, oh, your house looks a bit different. And so, yeah, it's only, I guess, as I got older, and now I'm reflecting back on all these things that were formative and making me who I am, and I'm like, oh, yeah, this is a Pacific Island thing to have a beautiful decorated altar. And that's a trimmed down version. It was bigger over the years. Yeah, and to do cultural things, to eat cultural food, to have these beliefs that big is beautiful and skinny is weak, and yeah, all of that. And then now I have my own family. My husband is Tongan, born in Tonga, but raised in New Zealand by his mum, his adopted mum, who's Māori. And so we have even more. So my grandma would call me a fruit salad, and so we have even more fruit saladier kids as well. And thinking about their ethnicity and how they identify and what is their connection or thoughts around identity is really interesting to me, and it's something that I'm looking forward to seeing how they relate to their Pacific Island identity as well. So when I was preparing this talk, I was thinking, why am I even interested in this? And it's probably because questions like this, where are you from, or even what are you, were always complex to me. And I would see other people answer them quite easily, oh, I'm from this place, blah, blah, blah. And then when someone asks me, where are you from? I'm like, oh, do they want the long version or the short version? Like, what should I say? What do they mean? And then something else that I was reminded of when I was preparing this talk was that I guess what I didn't know about ethnicity growing up. And so when I was a first year sports science student, and I was sitting, it might have even been my first semester, and I was sitting in sport and sociology, and we were having our very first lecture on ethnicity. So I knew nothing. I had my whole life told people that I was half Irish, quarter Samoan, quarter Cook Island. And so that's what I had said my whole life. My parents, that's how they probably described me. That's how my grandparents described me. Everyone described me as that. And they were happy for me to be that. My grandparents were, happy for me to have this, they didn't call me half caste, but this Afakasi identity where, you get to be in both worlds. And they were like proud that I was both. It was never that you were half, it's always that you were both. And so sitting in this first year sociology lecture, and the lecturer asks, so what ethnicity are you? And there's probably like 60 students in my class, but let's say there's 20 probably just weren't even ever there. And I'm a very empathetic student, and so I see the awkward silence, and I'm like, okay, I raise my hand for this lecturer. I put my hand up and I say, I'm half Irish, quarter Samoan, quarter Cook Island. And she laughs. And I was just mortified. I'm a first year student. I'm trying to make new friends at university who are sitting next to me, and it's just silence. And then I didn't hear any of the rest of the lecture because internally I was mortified. And reflecting on that, I was like, I don't quite know why she laughed. Like, is it because I said it in like a blood quantum way? Or, I'm not quite sure why she laughed. So when I was preparing this talk, I was thinking we could just start, make no assumptions about what people know, and just start from very basics beginning, because absolutely do not want anyone to ever feel laughed at for describing their ethnicity, how they have, particularly if they had never been educated on ethnicity. Cool. So, in saying that, very basic level, ethnicity is a social construct that influences people's experiences and outcomes of the world. It is not biological differences, it is not genetics, and it is a really strong evidence-based marker of need. And so the talk nowadays with the government is that ethnicity is not a good marker and that we need colourblind variables like deprivation index or something like that. But that's absolutely not true, and that there's long-standing high-quality evidence that ethnicity is a really solid marker of need. And so Stats New Zealand is responsible for the definition of ethnicity for the census, and then everything kind of flows from the census. And so they define ethnicity as an ethnic group or groups a person identifies with or has a sense of belonging to. It is a measure of cultural affiliation. So it's not race, ancestry, nationality, or citizenship. And this demographic attribute is self-perceived, and a person can belong to more than one ethnic group. And so when I read that, I was like, see, I know. I told that lecturer I am allowed to belong to more than one. And so, yeah, there's three kind of key elements from that. So it must be self-identified where possible. The example of when it couldn't be self-identified might be if you're a baby, that you are absolutely allowed to choose multiple ethnicities, and also that your ethnicity can change over time. So there's something called ethnic mobility. And at first I thought that that's impossible because I never would have thought about changing the way that I describe my ethnicity. But actually, when I was living in Australia, there were times where I was like, oh, maybe I should just put New Zealand because that would be like easier for everyone if I did that. So I can kind of get the ethnic mobility now. So Stats NZ creates this definition, which I think is really important because I think everyone should use the same definition of things to make better research. And so the definition from Stats NZ informs the ethnicity data protocol. And so this is a set of standard procedures about how to collect, record, and use ethnicity data in the health and disability sector. Okay, and so it's all about collecting ethnicity accurately and consistently across the health system. And I'm going to go through parts of the ethnicity data protocols. That's why I mean it's a bit geeky, my talk, but hopefully you'll get it by the end. So when you collect ethnicity, it is recommended that you use this standard ethnicity question and that you don't deviate from that. It should be self-completed, so by the person. If you're asking someone their ethnicity verbally, in the data protocols there is a script of how to ask someone for their ethnicity verbally, and as part of that you would actually ask them that question and then you would start listing the ethnicities as well. So there's a standardized way of asking, and that your responses should allow a minimum of 6 different ethnicities to be chosen as well. And you might think that's super simple, Alana. Of course, everyone can use a standardized question template, but this data would say that it's not that easy and it's not simple. So 1 in 5 Māori not identified as Māori on the NHI compared to the census. It's worse if you're a Māori male, particularly if you're young, between 20 to 24 years old, about 30% discrepancy in the data. And that it's also worse if you identify with multiple ethnicities. The data accuracy or data quality is worse. So it's not these stats would say it's not as simple or as easy as it might seem as using a standard question. And I really like this quote from this the Māori Health Authority Action Plan, where it says, Māori have the right to be counted. Being counted is an acknowledgement of being valued. So it's really important to have good data. So here are some examples of non-standard questions in primary healthcare. And given primary healthcare, I'm meant to use the data protocols, and these are their non-standard questions. And in research, we don't have a data protocol for ethnicity. And so I don't know what kind of non-standard questions are out there for researchers, but yeah, maybe some of these look familiar to you. But now hopefully you know that they are not a standard question and that we should all just use the standard question to make everything more consistent. Also part of the data protocols is processing the data. So that involves how to clean it when you get not typical responses, how to aggregate it into groups. So you might have seen level 1 ethnicity reported, and it's with these 6 broad categories. So European, Māori, Pacific, Asian, Mila, and other. To level 4 is the most detailed level, and there's 233 categories for that. And then also part of processing ethnicity data is the output method, which I'm going to talk about soon. So aggregating them into groups represents these different levels. And so most people will go with level 1, which, let's say if I was Tahitian, that would put me as a Pacific person. At level 2, if I was Tahitian, I'm considered other Pacific. Level 3, other Pacific. And then only when I'm at level 4 do I get to be Tahitian as I identify. So down at level 4, there's this, we get to see the beautiful diversity of our Pacific people. And then up at level 1, we get this averaged out amalgamation of all these different Pacific ethnicities. This is what I put into AI to ask what does a generic Pacific person look like? And, this is what and so, yes, some would say that this level 1 or this umbrella term Pacific is a unifying term. You know, it's bringing everyone together, which is true. It's great and it can be unifying, but is it erasing our individuality as well?
I see people looking like that every day.
Oh, yeah? Yeah. That's because you live up north. So part of processing the data is, you know, putting them into groups that you want to compare. So there's some common groups that we see in healthcare or common comparisons. And then these different output methods, which is what I wanted to talk about. So total response overlapping is an output method that's used in the census, and it's the most recommended one used by StatsNZ. And that's because everyone gets to identify with the ethnicity that they want to, and they get to identify with multiple ethnicities and be counted in multiple groups. Prioritized ethnicity is the most commonly used one in health, which I'll go into a bit soon, but it's where you put people into one ethnicity using this priority order. So if I'm Chinese Samoan, now I won't be considered Asian, I'd only just be considered Pacific, okay, because Pacific is above Asian in the priority order. And soul combination output is this, I'm not sure how often it's used, but it's this one where if you only identify with one ethnicity, then you just be in that group, but if you identify with multiple, then you get to be in these multiple ones as well. So like I said, total response is where you're assigned to each of the ethnic groups that you specify for yourself. And so for me, that means at level 4, I get to be Samoan, Cook Island, and Irish. And at level 1, I get to be Pacific and European. So I'm counted in all these groups, which can sometimes not be great for someone's stats because now I'm one person and I've been counted twice. I'm one person and I've been counted 3 times. With the prioritized output, at level 2 priority, I would be Cook Island only. And then at level 1, I would be Pacific only. And so you're forcing someone into one ethnic group. And then soul combination, it's like maybe I would be in this European Pacific group, and then I could be compared to people that were just Pacific, people that were just European. So that's soul / combination. And so, like I said, prioritized ethnicity is the most common one used in health. And it's great for statistical analyses because now we get one person to be one number on our spreadsheet. But the negatives are that you lose a lot of detail when grouping. So forcing people into a category is incongruent with ethnicity being self-identifiable. So multi-ethnic people like me now become one ethnicity only. It also overrepresents groups at the expense of others. So to amplify Māori representation, now the Pacific numbers as a consequence would decrease for people that are Māori and Pacific. Also, there's potential for misrepresentation. So if I'm Māori Samoan, I'd be identified as Māori, but maybe that might not be my strongest cultural affiliation. And I wasn't able to really unpack how or who decided the priority levels, but they're basically artificial levels that someone's deemed as being this is the priority order. Okay, so at level 2 ethnicity, Tongan is a higher priority than Samoan. Like it's just kind of artificial. Cool. But regardless, I appreciate that sometimes you just have to choose any output method. But what would be really helpful is if you report what output method you choose, because it affects the data, right? So you should always say what level you aggregated to and the method that you chose for your output of ethnicity. And I got a little bit cranky about this last year, and I wrote a letter to the editor, to the NZMJ, because I've been reading some papers, and some had used, one had used total response overlapping, then another had used prioritize, and I was like, okay. And then I started reading some more, and they didn't even say anything. And so I was like, well, that's a bit poor, and also I felt like the journal could have been the person to catch that and to ask them to report that in their journal. Yeah, so like I said, I'm not saying that one output method is particularly better or superior to another, but at a minimum, you should say what you chose. Okay, so that was my geeky part, over and done with. Hopefully you learned something. Now to talk about Pacific people in Aotearoa. And I guess kind of get at this idea, are we one people or are we many different people? But before that, I wanted to clarify some terminology. And this is copied from the NZMJ website, which is copied from Health NZ. And this is their advice for Pacific terminology. So when you refer to a group of nations, you could use the term Pacific. If you're referring to multiple population groups in the Pacific, you can use Pacific peoples. If you're talking about a small number of specific Pacific Island nations, then you should use their name specifically. That you should avoid Pacifica or Pacifica with the different I's, unless your Pacific community is the audience that is the relevant translation. So these are like transliterations of the word Pacific, right? And so Pacifica spelled like this is more of a Samoan translation. Pacifici like this is more of a Tongan translation. Pacifica with a C is not acceptable because there's no C in the Pacific Island languages, except for Fiji, I think, but the C is a th, it's a TH. So that's not acceptable. And that sometimes writing it like this, Pacifica, is when maybe academics are trying to refer to the Pacific diaspora in New Zealand, so as a migrant population in New Zealand. Maybe this term is like labeling that. But regardless, it was a term that was created by the New Zealand government to label people as migrants, and it wasn't a label that was created by the Pacific people.
Are you saying that only use Pacifica, only Samoan audience people can use Pacifica?
No, I'm saying it's more polite if you were talking to a mostly Samoan audience to use the correct transliteration of Pacific in Samoan language. And if you're mostly referring to a Tongan audience, you might use the transliteration for Tongan. Yeah,
that's okay for me to use it. Not really.
If you were mostly talking about Samoan people, then you might want to use it, or Tongan. But if you are unsure, then Pacific peoples up here is in English referring to Pacific people as a group would be the most inclusive term to use. Cool. So some demographics of Pacific people in New Zealand, and most of this data is from the 2023 census. So Pacific people, we make up about 8.9% of the total New Zealand population. From that includes 17 different ethnicities, most of which are Samoan, as you can see here. Hopefully you can read this. Then followed by Tongan, Cook Island Māori, Niuean, Fijian, and then going down to some of our smaller nations. Most Pacific people in New Zealand are born in New Zealand, so 67%, with 30% born overseas. Most Pacific people speak English, so 91%. A lot of Pacific people speak more than one language, so 38%. And if you see Samoan is listed here as the third most common language spoken in New Zealand, equal with Chinese. Pacific people are more likely to be multi-ethnic than the rest of the population. So 43% identify with more than one ethnicity, compared to only 15% of the total population. And roughly about 20%, although I was still waiting for the exact figures to come out on that, of Pacific people identify as both Māori and Pacific. So we're more diverse, and our younger population is increasingly more diverse as well. A little bit more on that. So whether you're born in New Zealand or you're born overseas, you're more likely to be multi-ethnic. So here, if you're Samoan, New Zealand born, you're around 55% more likely to be multi-ethnic. And the same kind of showing here with the orange bar being Māori. So if you're New Zealand born Samoan, about 15% are Māori. Cook Island Māori, about 20% of Māori. So as you can see, if we are using the prioritised output method in our data, all of these people that identify as Māori as well are now only Māori, and they're not Pacific too. Most people are aware that Auckland's the unofficial Pacific capital of the world. So Pacific people overwhelmingly live in Auckland compared to other areas of New Zealand. We make up about 16.6% of the Auckland population, and we mostly live in these areas in South Auckland. Pacific people are young. So this is the age profile. So this is 0 to 4 years up top. This is 90 years old. These green lines are the total New Zealand population. So we're overrepresented in the younger age group and less so in the older. So our median age is 24.9 years old compared to 38.1 in the total New Zealand population. And in terms of just the Auckland population, it's 25.6 compared to Europeans being 39.7 of a median age, so quite a youthful group. However, there's variation in our median age between the different Pacific Island nations. So here's Fijian here. The median age is close to 30. Pitcairn Island, over 30 years old is the median age. Whereas if you're Nauruan, your median age is under 20. If you're Tuvaluan, you're just over 20. Same with Tongan, kind of just over 20. So there's a lot of variation between the different Pacific Island nations that we're only, I guess, can only see if we look at the data in this way. There's a life expectancy gap between Pacific people and the rest of New Zealand. So Pacific is here in this light blue. Everyone together is the dotted line. Up here is Asian, down here is Māori, and European other is just above that dotted line. And so you can see there's a persistent, long-lasting gap. Some may say it's improving, I don't know about this part of it though, but yeah, it's there. And I guess the conditions that they've calculated contributing to that life expectancy gap are cardiovascular disease, diabetes, renal failure, cancer, and then a small amount of injuries and infections as well. And I didn't pull out lots of Pacific health data, but in general, Pacific people have poorer health and unmet needs for healthcare across many domains. Okay, so to the very kind of common ones: 2 times more likely to have ischemic heart disease, 3 times more likely to have diabetes. Lots of Pacific people's deaths are amenable, which means they could have been modified or helped, or they could have been prevented completely in the first place. And Pacific people experience really high rates of chronic conditions and comorbidities. So for Pacific people over the age of 65, 32% have a single chronic condition compared to only 20% of Europeans, and an additional 35% experience multiple morbidity. So it's not a great story because basically says Pacific people are more likely to get sick, more likely to die, and more likely to have complex issues. But if we look at the heterogeneity of Pacific people's health, and there's not that much data about it out there, but it is growing, you can see there are some differences that maybe we shouldn't average and group everyone together. So Cook Island women are 60% more likely to smoke than Samoan women. Tongan men had the highest proportion of smoking in this study. Tongan women had the lowest proportion of smoking. Tongan women and Niuean men and women had the highest burden of diabetes compared to other Pacific groups. Niuean men and women had lowest blood pressure levels, whereas Tongan men and women had the highest cholesterol levels. 60% of Tongan men are obese, whereas only 23% of Cook Island men are obese. So there's a bit of variation in the limited amount of data I guess we do have. Here's another study on the cause-specific mortality between different Pacific groups, and you can see huge variation where Cook Island people are more likely to die from cardiovascular disease, whereas Tongan people were less likely to die from cardiovascular disease. And I guess with this growing body of evidence, there's been multiple calls for more granular data, not just from Health New Zealand, I just put that up there, from lots of places have been asking for this because they see that a lack of data, a limitation in understanding Pacific people's health is this lack of data available by the Pacific subgroupings, and that averages and results may mask issues that impact one subgroup more than another. So in saying that, what I'm trying to do with the study that I'm working on with the cardiac rehabilitation data at Auckland DHB is to look at the Pacific subgroupings separately and as their own. So there's a study by a colleague of mine, Paul Marshall from Auckland University, and it's basically a retrospective audit of the cardiac rehabilitation program at Auckland DHB with the data from 2016 to 2020. In brief, what they found was that the cardiac rehabilitation program meant that readmission for kidney disease was less likely at 24 months for those that participated in the program compared to those that didn't participate, and that mortality was less likely at 12 and 24 months for those that participated versus those that didn't. And this is for everyone as a whole together. So what I am doing is to do a sub-analysis on Pacific people's data using this data set. I would say what I've shown here is only preliminary because we're going to expand into more years to get more data, and that I'm trying to get better ethnicity data rather than just the prioritized ethnicity to level 2. We also have a student doing a propensity matching study as well on the same data set.
What does that mean?
It's like really complicated stats.
Oh, okay.
Where you kind of match, you say you better match people and then you see what was their likelihood for a successful outcome. So yeah, what I've got so far from the 2016 to 2020 data, but like I said, I'm going to expand that, is that there were 345 Pacific patients from the sample of 3,331, keeping in mind that this is prioritized ethnicity data. So I suspect I'm missing a few people. The range of ethnicities that we have in this sample are pretty characteristics of the different size Pacific Islands populations in New Zealand. And there were some baseline differences between different Pacific Island groups compared to non-Māori, non-Pacific. That's what this is. Although little difference between the Pacific Island nations, except for Fijians had less tobacco use at admission compared to Tongan patients. But overall, differences between non-Māori, non-Pacific, and not so many differences between nationalities. In terms of their baseline conditions, so when they were admitted to hospital from a cardiac event, the proportion of patients with diabetes was greater in all the Pacific ethnicities compared to non-Māori, non-Pacific, except for Cook Island patients. Samoan patients were more, had a greater proportion of heart failure. Niuean, Samoan, and Tongan had a greater proportion of kidney disease compared to non-Māori, non-Pacific. But in terms of attending at rehab, so only 48% of Pacific patients accessed cardiac rehab, so attended one session, compared to 56% of the non-Māori, non-Pacific, which is still incredibly low for both groups. But yeah, in terms of comparisons of what sessions they did, so the program has lifestyle sessions, which I guess are educational, and it has physiotherapy-led sessions, which are more physical exercise-based. And so Samoan and Tongan participants were less likely to attend the lifestyle sessions. But I guess what the main findings are so far, but I don't want to talk about it too much because I'm going to increase the data set anyway, was that beneficial impact of attending cardiac rehabilitation that I talked about in Paul Marshall's study is not present for the Pacific ethnicities. So there's no kidney readmission at 12 and 24 months. That was absent, and the impact on mortality at 12 and 24 months was absent for Pacific people attending cardiac rehab in Auckland. So some final thoughts that I just wanted to chuck in there while I have time. I know I've gone super over, Debbie, and you haven't even interrupted me. But I just wanted to throw out a few other things about Pacific data while I had everyone here. And so essentially, you can't talk about Pacific data without talking about Pacific data sovereignty. And so that's about the control and ownership of the data, ensuring that it aligns with Pacific people's cultural values, principles, and aspirations for that data. So it's more than just where the data is stored. It's about the ethical use, management, and the benefit sharing of the data for the right communities. There's also another lens to look at the data is Pacific equity or data equity lens. And why I wanted to bring this up is because, you know, a critical component of data equity is that data is not objective. It reflects people's biases and those who are controlling and collecting the data. Okay, so the data, the way data is designed reflects what matters to those who define it and design it. Yeah, so I guess that speaks to having more of the Pacific people at the table making these decisions about the data. I did want to acknowledge this report. If you have a data set and you're thinking of improving how ethnicity is represented in that data set, this is what this report has just done. So for the New Zealand Cancer Registry, they realised that they were asking people to list their top 3 ethnicities, which is not the standard way of asking for ethnicity. And so they went through this procedure of mapping it better to build a more comprehensive data set. I also wanted to make clear that if you have ethnic-specific data, then that can drive ethnic-specific solutions, which might seem really hard, but this is what this is a framework of 7, if not, they've got 8 now. They've added Kiribati as well. So ethnic-specific, cultural frameworks and toolkits for different Pacific Island nations. Okay, so a Fijian cultural framework, and this is all related to family violence in New Zealand. And each of these frameworks have their own ethnic-specific workshop associated with it, ethnic-specific resources that have been developed for it, and I don't know if they've measured the outcomes, but I would just really think that this was a better approach than a generic Pacific-led one. So that if you care enough about ethnic-specific solutions, that you can make it happen. Okay, some of my final takeaways. So I hope that this talk would make you appreciate ethnicity as a valuable variable in research, and that it should be treated as such. It's not an easy demographic variable that you just ask people to fill out the same time that they fill out their name. There's a bit more of a procedure and thinking behind it. That New Zealand's Pacific population is diverse, but in the data we're usually, that diversity is usually invisible. So what are we missing out on? This house is different to this house, if you're not aware. Pacific is not actually an ethnicity, it's a grouping. Okay, it's an umbrella term. No one would say, hi, I'm Pacific. No, you would say, hi, I'm Samoan, whatever. I hope I've encouraged you to be conscious of the heterogeneity of Pacific peoples and how this might apply to your research. And that's something that I haven't talked about, which is super important is that Pacific values, these can be shared between the different Pacific nations, but they're also distinct in their own right. And Pacific values are really important to Pacific people. Cool. So thank you for listening. This is my daughter Kiara with the tapa cloth that she made at Canteen.